Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, people of all fandoms, welcome to the Ferret and Raccoon podcast, episode 134. I am the Angry Raccoon, your only host for this podcast, and the first thing I want to say, or more or less apologize for, is this episode is going to be a little noisy. It possibly might even sound a bit weird, given that a whole bunch of nonsense has happened over the last few days. Now, the main thing I am referring to is the fact that England is currently being hit by a storm at the moment, which means that you might actually hear the wind and the rain if it gets any worse. So I want to apologize that straight away. There is nothing I can do about that. I cannot control the weather. I'm sure some of you may be wondering, since I did know about the storm, why didn't you record this podcast a few days earlier? Well, the reason being was that I decided to take a day off a few days ago, and then my internet went down. So I couldn't exactly complete this podcast, given that even though I had so little to talk about anyway, but I wanted to make sure I had my facts and all my information there, and I didn't really want to give you a podcast that was based on purely just memory or what I wanted to talk about, if that makes sense. So I am really sorry if this podcast ends up being a bit of a mess. I apologize for that. That was poor planning on my behalf. I generally haven't had that great of a week, more or less. I've had a few issues with health. Nothing too serious, but enough to be annoying and be a bit distracting. Let's just say I'm a bit frustrated that I decided to change up things in my life, in my daily life structure, and that one change has really messed things up and really made me regret even bothering to change. So I'm over it now, though. I'm trying to recover, and I want to at least get this podcast out on time for the 10th of February. Hopefully it does. And let's move on to this very quick podcast, unfortunately. I was planning on watching a few more films. I did tease I was going to be watching some longer films, but as the internet has gone down in my house, haven't really been able to do that. But I'll be watching them for the next podcast, and hopefully we'll have more people on said next podcast. Everyone is pretty much busy with life and their jobs. We're all working towards something special, as I'm sure we've hinted at before in the podcast. But the first film I want to talk about, which was one that was on my list for a while, and I finally got to see it, which was Bone Tomahawk from 2015 or 16. And this film is a part Western, part horror film. And it's pretty interesting because you do kind of hear the novelty of Western and horror. You think it's going to be an all-out Western horror, and it's pretty much split down the middle in terms of both genres. It is form and foremost a Western film with a lot of horror and disturbing and gory elements. I would say if you are not a fan of gore, do not watch this film, because there are some pretty upsetting scenes in this film. But overall, it's a pretty good film for what it is. I really do like it. I think the whole cast was fantastic, and I do think for what they achieved with such a small film, because not that much really happens in terms of a 2-hour long film, but it's interesting what does happen. It pretty much is a film about a journey and a destination, much like most Westerns, but with a twist. And the main characters we are accompanied by being a few very famous faces. I can't really remember too many of them other than Kurt Russell. But yeah, it's a really interesting film. I would recommend. I don't want to spoil too much of it because it's still a pretty fresh film, and I know a lot of people talk about certain scenes and all this and all that, but I would highly recommend if you can get a chance, especially if you're into horror or you want to see something that's a little bit of a genre mix or bend. Next film I finally got to see, which I did see with Owl, friend of the podcast, who has been on various podcasts, is The Lighthouse from 2019, which has just released in this country of about a few days as at the time of this recording. And before I actually talk about the film, I want to mention that it was actually pretty convenient and actually to our benefit that when we did see the screening, we saw it early morning, so we had a completely empty cinema screening, which was pretty great. So we got to sit right at the front and really absorb the film as well, which I do believe was unintentional. Was throughout the film the heating changed. So for example, at first it was very cold and then it got very warm as the film went on, so it was almost like another element of psychological play while watching this film, because The Lighthouse is very much a psychological nightmare, paranoia-inducing horror ghost story. Not to spoil too much, but it was a fascinating and masterfully done film that really does take from the old and kind of does its own thing in a very interesting way. It does feel like the classic ghost story, in terms of, like, you know, two characters in a setting and you don't know who these characters are and that kind of element. And there are more traditionally old-fashioned elements like the way they talk. I can imagine some people probably won't actually understand what they're saying, but you know, just open your ears, I would say. And, you know, well performed, well shot. It is a fantastic looking film. It's almost hard to watch some of the behind the scenes you know, shots and see it in color because it almost doesn't seem right. But if it does look like the kind of film you want to see, if you want to see a different kind of horror film and you're something that isn't just, you know, complete jump scares, and something that's a little bit more twisted and possibly up for interpretation, I would highly recommend The Lighthouse. And the last thing I want to mention is I did speak about how I finished the game Borderlands 3. Well, I've now platinumed the game. I have every trophy/achievement in it, which didn't actually take too long. It was a matter of one trophy in particular being a bit awkward to get because a lot of people don't really play online. But I finally managed to get that trophy, and yeah, the game's platinumed, so I'm pretty happy about that. It was stuff I was going to do anyway. I didn't need to go out of my way, so it was an easy accomplishment. But moving on to the next games and moving on to our first topic of this podcast, and that is going to be regarding video games, and that is going to be Platinum Games and it launching its Platinum 4 website and its first Kickstarter as part of this Platinum 4 project or series or whatever they really want to call it. So, quick little history fact. Platinum Games essentially are a video game developer who have essentially made some more significant games. I'm sure that you've heard of, like, Vanquish and Bayonetta. More recently, they put out Astral Chains, which was on the Switch. So they're pretty up there in terms of their profile. And with this recent announcement, Platinum 4, they were teasing there's going to be 4 reveals or 4 surprises. And the first one came out, which is going to be a remaster of the Wonderful 101, which was a Nintendo Wii U game. Incredibly underrated, and not a lot of people played it, mainly because of the poor sales that the Wii U had in general. And I think just unfortunate, really. And they started a Kickstarter for its remaster. And before I get into that, because I know a lot of people meet Kickstarters with a lot of skepticism because, you know, it makes complete sense given the platform and it is completely justifiable and understandable why you'd be skeptical. So I want to mention a few things regarding this situation, Platinum Games and its Kickstarter, just because I know that, you know, certain questions and things will be brought up. So I did enough research and I want to kind of, you know, put my stamp on things and kind of give people enough information so they can decide, even after hearing all these things and weighing up the issues, if they are interested in funding the Kickstarter, they at least have these things to go by. And I guess the first thing I want to address is the fact that a lot of people will possibly reference the fact that, you know, aren't Platinum Games, like, you know, a AAA developer? You know, why are they, you know, not funding their own game? And I think, well, simply put, they're a developer studio. You know, they publish and partnership with other companies. You know, they themselves are not the publishers. They make games. That's it. And then they look for publishers. Hence why, you know, Sega and Nintendo have published a lot of their games like Bayonetta and the aforementioned Wonderful 101, Astral Chain. So they're not as big as someone like Capcom, who are an independent developer studio, who put out their own AAA games. They're not as big as them. You know, they're technically a small studio. You know, they only have like about just over 200 people working on it. If you look at something like Activision or EA, they have a good few tens of thousands of people that work for them, which they then later fire. So that's worth mentioning before anyone is trying to claim that they're greedy for asking more money. And even then, the Kickstarter started at like 35,000 just for a PC port, which I think that's adequate. I think that's not necessarily asking too much, in my opinion. The next thing I want to mention is a lot of people probably be wondering, is this game technically not a Nintendo exclusive, given that it was only on the Nintendo Wii U? And it is and it isn't. is kind of the answer, because Nintendo essentially gave their blessing and were like, yeah, you can take the IP, intellectual property of it back and do what you want with it, because it technically is your game, which is quite nice of Nintendo, because I mean, they're still going to get a share of whatever the game makes on that platform, so that's pretty cool. I'd like to see more bigger publishers and studios actually do that with these companies that are still around. That would be a nice gesture, as a nice hint. And the one thing I want to mention, which is, I guess, is the more controversial thing, which is still controversial since it's been announced, and that is that Platinum, as of this year, has essentially gotten funding from the Chinese government-funded company Tencent, who, as I've mentioned, are a kind of intellectual, massive media company that essentially funds basically anything, more or less Western media, in terms of, in a way to essentially, well, this is where it kind of gets a bit concerning, because I don't necessarily know what Tencent does, and I'm not going to say they are complete evil, and I'm not going to say they are not complete evil, because what they may or may not be doing isn't that far off from what a lot of countries in the West are doing in terms of other kind of capitalistic and evil situations that go on. But essentially, they fund whatever they see fit in a way that where how the person they are funding benefits of this is that their games, for example, are essentially published in China, because China doesn't really have a lot of Western games published over there, and somewhat in return, they essentially kind of might have a bit of power or sway over said company within the grand scheme of, China being in control of a lot more media. That's how I see it. Do not quote me as that being fact in terms of what they are doing. That's just how I see the situation. So Platinum has received funding from a company like that, and which is a bit upsetting, because I don't like that kind of stuff, especially not from a game developer I really, really like. But it is worth mentioning that Platinum is still an independent studio, despite the fact that they will now be self-publishing these games thanks to the funding. And yeah, Tencent have nothing to do with this Kickstarter or this Platinum 4 project. So everything to do with Platinum doing this, these 4 project things, that is all Platinum Games. But if obviously the fact that Tencent and this whole Chinese government funding thing bothers you, then that is completely fine. I just wanted to mention that because it is important. It's best not to overlook said facts when giving your money to a company that, well, yeah, that's pretty much as stated. But back to the positives of this whole situation, being the first reveal, being the Wonderful 101 remaster. I honestly couldn't be happier that the Kickstarter has already reached over 1 million, essentially achieving its stretch goals of getting a PC, Switch, and PlayStation 4 port. Some of you may have already noticed that there is no Microsoft or X1 version, and I think that's possibly because of bad blood between them and having their last game, Scalebound, being cancelled by Microsoft, because Microsoft is too much of a pushy company that wants to own everything. That's what I think might be the issue. Hey, maybe one of the stretch goals might be a X1 or Xbox Series X or whatever they're going to call that console version. But I'm just happy more people can play this fantastic game, because I really think it's an underrated game that's really unique and really goes places. I mean, if you're a fan of just action, wild craziness, or Platinum games in general, and you haven't played this game, it is worth playing. Even if you're a big fan of like the Suda51 games like No More Heroes and Lollipop Chainsaw and stuff like that, games that are games and really out there, this is definitely a game to essentially strive and try and play, especially now that it's going to become more available on platforms, which I think is fantastic. I love it when people can play something they find out they never knew about and can finally enjoy, if that makes sense. In terms of like speculating what the next 3 reviewers are going to be, I am really hoping that one of them is going to be a Mad World remaster, which is a fantastically stylized and gory and original Nintendo Wii game that came out. This is like one of their first games they ever made. I would love to see a HD remaster of that, because that game is pretty damn fantastic. Definitely look up the game Mad World by Platinum Games. It is fantastic. Moving on to our next topic, which is going to be the only 2 trailers we're going to talk about, which kind of have some similarities. And the first one is going to be Fast and Furious 9. And, I mean, with this series, you pretty much love it or hate it at this point. Right now, it's not really going to go anywhere. It makes stupid amounts of money. And one thing I did find that was quite funny is that I love how this series, even in this film, which is far more prominent, they always stress about the importance of, like, family. And even Vin Diesel now has a family with a child as well. Yet Vin Diesel himself forgot about his brother, who's now the main villain. Yeah, that's some really convenient, like, writing there, guys. Like, he doesn't have to be his brother. He could just be another bad guy who's from another organization. Is a bit of a stretch. It doesn't need to be that personal. But, yeah, this trailer is interesting. I mean, there are some pretty interesting, like, you know, set pieces and, you know, some really stupid and, you know, kind of hard to take serious moments, much like as the series has always been known for. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and act as if, like, oh, the franchise really got stupid in the fifth one. No, it's always been silly. But I think now it's just like, it's hard to really laugh at it or go with it because I can't really understand the intention of what exactly it's trying to go for. I can't tell if it's laughing at itself or it's really serious, given a lot of the stupidness is happening, especially that whole, you know, when the car goes off the bridge and, like, they somehow get the wire strapped and it's swinging around and it flings the car and it makes it fly. That's a bit questionable. But the villain himself being Mr. John Cena himself, who usually is in reality, he's a pretty relaxed person, and sometimes he's a very you know, fun and playful actor. Here, he's downright pretty intimidating for the most part, which is pretty cool because none of the villains in any of these films have ever been intimidating. They've usually just been a massive joke. But that's new. That's interesting. And I mean, it looks fine. It doesn't look like the worst thing ever. It looks like it's competently made. It looks like it'll be fine. There's definitely money put to good use, I guess, technically. The film doesn't look like crap. You know what I mean? It looks like it's going to be a film that looks gorgeous to some extent. And I guess one of the big things which has people talking is the fact that Han from Tokyo Drift is back, who died in Tokyo Drift, which I find quite interesting because I cannot wait to hear them essentially poorly retcon and explain how he's still alive. Yeah, I understand that these films are like prequels and sequels to each other, but it's really silly at the end of the day, honestly. I'd rather you just bring in a new character personally, or just, you know, do something a bit more original. But hey, that's this franchise, and that's Broke Hollywood for you. Speaking of Broke Hollywood, we have our final and next trailer. Sorry this podcast is so short. There really wasn't a lot that I really cared about. I'm not going to talk about the damn Minions trailer because... But something that I did find kind of interesting, you know, despite thinking it was a joke originally, is Spiral, the book, you know, from the book of Saw. Sorry, I can't even get over the name of this. Yeah, Spiral from the book of Saw. This is the 9th installment in the Saw franchise. And when I first heard that Chris Rock and Samuel L. Jackson were going to be in this film, I honestly thought it was a joke. I thought this was like... You know how usually when you hear those stories and it's usually like, oh, we would love to get this person, or it's rumored that Samuel L. Jackson's going to be... And it's like, oh, wow, they actually got them. It's a bit ridiculous for the most part. But yeah, it's... You know, Lionsgate is desperately trying to keep the Saw franchise alive, and they're trying to essentially entice new audience into it by essentially calling this next film Spiral. Like, what? Like... So you had Saw films, which, you know, goes all the way to 8, and then you have... Sorry, it goes all the way to 7, excuse me. And then you have Jigsaw, and now you have Spiral, and it's like... Instead of confusing people, they should have just made it a spin-off. You know, if you're going to change the name, I mean... And the direction as well, given how the trailer plays out, but I'll get into that in a sec. Or at least give it a better subname, like I would have personally called it, you know, From the Case Files of Jigsaw, or the Jigsaw Murders, you know, or more from the Jigsaw Murders. I mean, that rings off the tail because immediately most people know of Jigsaw as opposed to some of the films, because they know what the little puppet looks like. He's pretty much a horror icon. You know, or they could make it into a TV series, have each episode focus on the aftermaths of someone failing one of the Jigsaw challenges, and then trying to figure it out in some sense, like, oh, how did he die? Who was he? How does the trap work? I think that would be a fantastic idea, and it would be a nice way to continue the franchise in a new and unique way. Here, it's just a bit questionable because I think the hardest sell is going to be Chris Rock himself. Most people know him as a comedian, or at least more in comedic roles. So seeing him in this very stripped down, serious police officer trying to chase down a mass serial killer who's hunting police officers, it's hard to take. But I will give him this. That they're trying something new with the direction. They're trying to be a little bit more creepy. They're trying to be a little bit more suspenseful, a lot less silly, although I have heard it is going to be a funny film, but, not necessarily a comedy. But this direction could work, and it would be nice to see them actually do something with the Saw franchise that isn't just, references and, more convoluted, backtracking and that. I mean, just look at the Fast and Furious franchise. That went from being just a film about heists and driving to pretty much a comic book movie. I mean, let's not lie. All those characters are superheroes, pretty much. And yeah, I mean, the trailer itself, I will say, it was decent. It didn't spoil too much. And I'm definitely interested to see what they're going to do with this film, who Samuel Jackson's character is, because his presence is there, but you don't really see him do too much. I'm hopeful for this film. I would like to see them, because the Saw franchise does have potential. It's just Lionsgate and whoever's in charge of it, they don't know what the hell they're doing. I mean, for goodness sake, they called the ninth film Spiral. And most people just call it Spiral, not necessarily from the Book of Saw, which is still a stupid name. I wouldn't be surprised if they called the next one Buzzsaw, but, that's just the kind of incompetence that is at Lionsgate. But anyway, that's pretty much going to wrap up this podcast. Sorry it's short, but I only really wanted to talk about what I thought was interesting and what I thought would interest you guys. And I guess we'll wrap this podcast up with the video of the episode, which is going to be an older video, but it's something I recently discovered, which I still think is pretty funny, and I won't spoil it, just given the title of it, and that is going to be Jon Benjamin with, "Well, I should have learned how to play the piano." And I won't go any further. All I'm going to say is, definitely watch the video and definitely give it a listen, because it is as you would expect, without spoiling too much. And that's pretty much going to wrap up this podcast. Hopefully it was enjoyable. Hopefully there wasn't too much background noise and stuff. This stuff was pretty much out of my hands. I apologize if it has ruined your experience. I promise that the next podcast will be better. I can't promise if anyone else will be on it, but there's something. And I guess I'll wrap this podcast up like I always do by saying I was the Angry Raccoon, and I will see you on the next podcast.